السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. A lot of exciting energy in the room. Excited energy in the room. Alhamdulillah. Bismillah. Bismillah. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. وأفضل الصلاة وأتم التسليم على سيدنا محمد سيد الأولين والآخرين وحبيب رب العالمين وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد طب القلوب ودوائها وعافية الأبدان وشفائها ونور الأبصار وضيائها وقوت الأرواح وغذائها وآله وصحبه وبارك وسلم. ربي زدنا علما ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. Alhamdulillah. Welcome back for session 2 of our exploration of Hikma Medicine and its application in the life of the believer. Alhamdulillah. So yesterday was our introduction, and today we'll be getting into it. And what I wanted to start with is a lecture on knowing thyself. It's a lecture that I've given multiple times in different places. It's always a fun lecture to give because it helps us begin to peel back the layers of the onion of ourselves and maybe those around us, to really get an inner look at who we are and what we're about and why we are the way we are. You know, there's so many unconscious patterns that operate within us, that emerge through different types of ways of thinking and ways of relating with one another, and even habits and even certain types of bad habits and addictions that we have, we keep coming back to. Those are not haphazard. Those are not coincidental in some way. That those are very much a part and parcel of your nafs, yourself, and that is decreed by Allah to be part of your struggle, part of your mujahada, part of your overcoming, part of your coming to know yourself and coming to know Him. Because that path is one. As Sayyidina Shaykh Yahya ibn Mu'adh, the great Sufi, said, "Man arafa nafsahu faqad arafa rabbah." Whoever comes to know his or her nafs. He didn't say qalb or ruh or the sir or whatever. He said nafs. Whoever comes to know their nafs knows their Lord, right? So it's like, know the roots of the tree and you will know and have access to the fruits, right? So this is what this lecture is about, inshaAllah ta'ala. We'll be talking about the 4 temperaments, the 4 elements, the 4 seasons. Now, this is a long topic, and we could spend the whole week exploring this. And I'm not being rhetorical when I say that. You know, we do like breakout groups and activities and projects, and even like we can dramatize them and have people playing different roles. It's a lot of fun. But for today, and maybe a little bit of tomorrow, we'll see how we go. I'm going to give you like a brief primer, and then maybe we can talk more about it off session if you guys would like. Okay? So I'm starting with a quote by one of the Hakims of the world. He wasn't a Muslim. I think he did predate Islam. But he says, "Man is a microcosm." Notice that language. We use that language too. Man is a microcosm, or a little world, because he is an extract from all the stars and planets of the whole firmament, from the earth and the elements. And so he, i.e. man, is their quintessence. It's the ultimate pinnacle of creation, the human being. And so captured within the human being are all the different types of elements, all the different types of levels of being. You know, the Hakims talk about the animal nafs and the vegetative nafs and the mineral nafs, that we have these minerals inside of us, right? We know we have iron, we have copper, we have zinc, we have all these elements. We have this vegetative process of being able to break down and make energy. And then the animal powers, the quwwat al-haywaniya, which are the animal powers of locomotion, right? And even of connection, that mammalian capacity to connect with one another, which plants don't have. Plants kind of pop up independent, right? Roots kind of now connect, and we know about the fungal world now connecting root systems in the forest, and really, really fascinating new knowledge we know about that. But you see trees kind of coming up independent. But the mammalian nature is a really special nature of bonding, of belonging, of connection, of the tribe, of the ummah. And so this language, though, of the microcosm, macrocosm, you find it in poetry, you find it in our literature, our tradition, you find it even in certain types of the athkar, like in Hizb al-Bahr, where Imam Abu al-Hasan al-Shadili says, فثبتنا وانصرنا وسخر لنا هذا البحر كما سخرت البحر لموسى وسخرت النار لإبراهيم وسخرت الجبال والحديد لداود. He's asking Allah Ta'ala to establish us and give us strength and to save us and to make easy for us the oceans and to make easy for us the mountains and make it easy for us all these different elements of the world, right? Because that was the mode of seeing the world for the great Imam and many of the Imams. Imam al-Ghazali, the great Imams, they saw the world through this four-element perspective. And so even you'll find in the tafasir, many of them will describe and do sharh of the ayat through this lens. They'll use this language, right? And so they were proficient in this language. They knew what they were talking about. You find it even in the Quran as well. In Surah Al-Waqi'ah. أَفَرَأَيْتُمْ مَا تَحْرُثُونَ أَفَرَأَيْتُمُ الْمَاءَ الَّذِي تَشْرَبُونَ أَفَرَأَيْتُمُ النَّارَ الَّتِي تُورُونَ. Right? There's all these different levels of, do you see what you cultivate? Do you see the water as it comes that you drink? Do you see the fire that strikes out? Right? Are you looking at these things? Allah is bringing attention to these things because He wants you to see how He acts in the world. Allah acts in the world through these different elements. He acts in the world in different levels, but one level that even here in the Quran Allah is bringing you awareness to is the four elements. So what is the purpose of this knowledge? This is a knowledge, this is ilm. Well, the purpose of our existence is to worship Allah, is to know Allah, right? ما خلقت الجن والإنس إلا ليعبدون أي ليعرفون. We have not created jinn kind and mankind except to worship me. And of course we know that worship me here means to know me. So knowledge is light, and it's a way of accessing Rabbul Alameen and the deepest parts of who we are, which is that relationship of ubudiyah with Allah Ta'ala. And we can know this knowledge, we can begin to understand and access this knowledge of signs by careful study of the natural world, of study of the self, and study of the book of Allah Ta'ala. Because there's different levels of books, and even the ulama say there's 3 books of Allah. There's actually 3 different types of books. There's Kitab al-Tadwini, there's Kitab al-Takwini, and Kitab al-Anfusi. Right? Kitab al-Tadwini is like the revealed books, which is the Quran. Kitab al-Takwini is the created book, the book of creation, the book of nature, the book of the world. And you have Kitab al-Anfusi, the book of the self. The book of the self. And what does Allah Ta'ala say in the Quran? We will show them our signs on the horizons and within themselves. Right? There's a revealing, there's a teaching, and on our part, there's a seeking of knowledge and a witnessing of the knowledge of Allah on the horizons and within ourselves. And what's the purpose of that? To know Him as al-Haq, to know Allah Ta'ala in His reality. So this is really, really, really important. And this is not important just for like the hakims and the physicians and stuff like that. This is a knowledge that Everyone should know. I believe teachers of deen should know this knowledge. Imam Al-Ghazali says about this knowledge that the teacher, it's almost obligatory for the teacher to know this. Why? If a teacher is teaching a matter and he has an eclectic group of students with different constitutions, they're going to learn differently, right? There's a certain type of student that picks up quick. We'll talk about it soon. They're just sharp, they're fast, they get things quickly. The first dars, and they're already grappling with level 2 of that knowledge and asking questions at the next level, and the teacher's like, whoa, slow down, this is lesson 1. But they already get it, and they're going to the next level. And there's another student, which is like, what are we talking about here again? I'm still thinking about yesterday's stuff. They're a little bit more slow, right? And there's nothing wrong with that, because one of the downfalls, or one of the kind of the challenges of the student that learns quick is that they forget quick too. And then the phlegmatic, the slower one, when they root their knowledge, they got it forever. Right? So it's not like a tit for tat thing. There's not one temperament that's better than the other. That's a silly way of thinking about it. Right? It's like thinking, what's better, the in-breath or the out-breath? It's a dumb question. You need both to survive. You need both to rest. Now, oh yeah, I can get closer. Are they? Bismillah. Okay. So we don't differentiate between the temperaments. There's a hikmah of Allah, there's a mercy of Allah, and there's gifts for that individual and the person around that individual in the way that they are. So we don't shame anybody. And so as a caveat for going into this, I don't want anyone to say, oh, you're such a so-and-so, oh, my mom is this, or whatever. Don't do that, right? Unless you're saying, oh, that person's so generous, no wonder, right? Because they're this or that, or they're so intelligent, and they're quick, and they're witty, oh, they're such a hard worker, oh, they're so patient. You can see the virtues in that. Don't use it as a way to break down people. That's not cool. Yeah, so he says, Imam Ghazali says, no, teachers should know this knowledge to be able to give every student what they need to grow, because the teacher's role is murabbi. It's tarbiyah. And the Rabb does what? He develops through stages, or she develops through stages, right? And each of these constitutions grow in a certain way. Every nafs has to heal in a certain way to grow, and has to be addressed in a certain way to grow. Right? There has to be a certain relationship with that type of person. And we know that. I think intuitively, this is part of emotional intelligence, is knowing what kinds of people we're speaking to, and doing ta'lif al-qulub, doing this connecting of the hearts and intermeshing of the hearts, and meeting them and being safe and not triggering them and pushing them away. And this is part of that elegant dance. And this can be a nice model for everyone to begin to intuit these things, to have more emotional intelligence. We are deeply in need of this intelligence now. We have a huge gap, a huge lack of emotional, relational, psychological intelligence, which is not our way. The Prophet ﷺ was deeply present with people, deeply compassionate, deeply witnessing. He gave space for everyone. He loved everyone. Even people that were kind of on the fringes of society, that were kind of maladjusted, not really civilized to the status quo of the culture, like the majdoobs, maybe we'd call them today, or maybe even those that have some conditions. He loved all of them equally. He didn't differentiate them. And the great sheikhs, you see them like that too, that the people that are on the fringe flock to the real sheikh, that they know that he's safe, and he witnesses their reality, and not just their outward, not just the zahir. So this is a knowledge that you can begin to intuit the essence of the person. This is also very important, as we touched upon upstairs in the small group, for parents. Because parents are murabbis as well. Inevitably, you're shepherding your children and you're raising your children. And so to know what kind of child you have is of the utmost importance. So you can give them what they need to grow, because that's your task, is to keep them safe, to help them grow. And the Prophet ﷺ was very constructive in his relationships. He didn't break people down. He elevated people and built them up. He made them strong. He helped them find their sense of self, their agency, find their virtues. And then if there is a challenge or some sort of blind spot in their nafs, he would reflect that. And he would do that gently. And that's the Muhammadan tarbiyah. It's constructive, it's positive, it's supportive. It's difficult though. And that's the ideal, and we want to be able to work towards the ideal, and we're all in process. I'm a parent, I'm not saying here that I do that perfectly. I'm not making that claim. But we want to put that as the ideal. If we put the ideal of the Prophet ﷺ spiritually in his relationship with Allah Ta'ala on this level, how about we put his parenting in the way he was relationally as well, and emotionally, open and present and feeling. Everyone felt they were the most beloved to him, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Why? Because he loved them. He truly loved them. That's why. It wasn't like he wasn't a good, it wasn't a trickster. He wasn't good at like manipulating them. He really loved them, and they really felt to him, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. So this is a knowledge that we can begin to use to cultivate more love and compassion for people, inshallah ta'ala. You can begin to appreciate people that are not like you. Wow, you're really not like me, and that's cool. I see that like there's another way of looking at things that's really interesting. You know, perspective, having a multi-perspectival approach to our relationships. Not just putting yourselves in their shoes, but really appreciating it. It's like, whoa, this is amazing. From this perspective, I can totally see why you did or said that thing, and why you took that approach, and why you believe what you believe. I see that. And there's a room for that in a healthy civilization, right? Having this rigid, one way of doing things is one of the temperaments, actually, extreme, in its extreme form. Hippocrates once said also, like, and he's what, the father of medicine, right? This guy is the father of medicine. Everyone now takes the Hippocratic oath, whether a naturopathic medical school student or a allopathic medical school student or osteopathic or whatever. They're taking his oath, and he says, it is more important to know what sort of person has a disease than to know what sort of disease a person has. Can I say that one more time? It is more important to know what sort of person has a disease than to know what sort of disease a person has, right? So from the Hippocratic perspective, a true diagnostic criteria would not be diagnosing the symptoms and putting them into packages and labeling them in a certain way and giving them a code. It would be understanding the individual that's being treated, that's expressing those symptoms. It's a whole different way of looking at it. That's part of the holistic approach, is to know, okay, you have this individual who's expressing these symptoms, and they have a nafs, and they have a ruh, and they have a jism. And I want to know the nature of that individual before anything else. Before I treat and do anything, I want to know the nature of that individual that's expressing those symptoms. Then I can really help them. But if I don't help them, and I just see, oh, this is a similar case to the thousands of other cases of similar symptoms, and I'll just give the same kind of generic intervention or remedy, it's not going to work, right? And you're not really helping them to really undo the underlying issues, and you might be harming them. So it's more important to know the type of person who's ailing than what they're ailing from. Ideally, you can do both, but here he's prioritizing one over the other. Okay, so with the elements, there's different traditions. Now, we're talking about the four, and I'm going to get into the four, but there's other systems as well. So when we talk about the four elements, we're talking about the Greek system, the Unani system, right, which is much of Islamic medicine is based on the Greek system. This is different than prophetic medicine. Of course, we don't really have this makes me upset, but we don't have like a real tradition of prophetic medicine anymore. We've lost it, unfortunately. We have like a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, recommending different things for different people, even sometimes different things for the same ailment, which is interesting because we're just talking about treating the individual, right? You see that in the prophetic medicine literature, but what we don't find is his his clinical approach. You don't find his philosophy. You don't find him talking about what he's thinking when he's administering a remedy. So it's difficult to inductively go back and figure that out because it's part of nubuwah ultimately, and I don't think anyone can really be a Shafi like he can anyways, because he's accessing something else, right? Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. But the Greek medicine is the system that basically the Muslim doctors employed as a foundational paradigm to build their system of medicine on. And it was based on the 4 elements of fire, air, earth, and water. Okay? Now this was actually taken, the original Greeks actually had 3, really interesting, which is similar to the Ayurvedic system, which has 3 doshas. It wasn't until the Greek physicians actually came to Egypt, which was the hotbed of intellectual knowledge, right, in the world. And they found that actually the Egyptian hakims were incorporating this 4th element. Anyone know the 4th element that was introduced? It was earth. It was black bile. Right? The Greeks did not have black bile, and the Ayurvedic system in India does not have earth. It's fire, water, air. This is interesting. But then you have different systems. The Chinese have 5 elements. They don't have air. They have instead, they add metal and wood. Right? So you have these different classifications, and they're all useful. They're all different languages you can use. They have sound grammar and syntax, whatever. It's a grammar of looking at the world, and they're all solid. It's like they're different madahib of hikmah, if you will. Yeah? Different madahib of hikmah. So the Muslims pretty much took the Greek, and that's what we're going to work with, inshallah ta'ala. This is also, we'll leave it at that. Okay. So I'm going to just talk about the 4 elements and the 4 temperaments. Ideally, we'd have diagrams and stuff. But inshallah ta'ala, we can talk more, and maybe I can present it somewhere else for those that are more visual. But for now, I'm going to go through the 4 elements and the 4 seasons. Okay, so we said the 4 elements were fire, air, earth, water. Fire, air, earth, water. So let's start with air. Okay? Air is associated with the season of spring. Air is associated with the season of spring, of new life, of rebirth. There is a hot and wet principle, and we can't get too much into this right now, but hot and wet principle is the principle of life of the spring season, right? Every season has a principle that it operates under. And so with the seasons, you have hot and wet, hot and dry, cold and dry, and then cold and wet. So with the season of spring, you have hot and wet. And this is how the new birth, after the death of winter, after the stagnation of winter, the dormancy of winter, new life comes, right? Winter is water, and so with the heat coming, right, the heat and the sun coming out, the heating up of the temperatures in the spring, and the water wetness of winter, you find this hot and damp situation that creates new life. And there's an explosion of life, and you see this explosion of life in the greenery that blooms in the mid-spring. So there's this expansive kind of energy that emerges in the spring. In the summer, what's the element of summer? Fire, right? Fire. So you have this ascension, you have this further expansion, long days, short nights, right? You have this increase of energy, this hot and dryness, where now everything is reaching its fruition in some way. You have things that begin to blossom and bloom in the spring. you have now those same foods, those same fruits now reaching maturation in the summertime, right? For the most part, you have some foods and fruits that will mature in the late harvest of the fall, but most harvest in the summer, right? And we're currently in that season now. Long days, short nights, intense heat, fire principle. Fire is very drying, right? Also, the long days tend to spend on us. The short nights, which are nights of rest, generally for us, repose, are shorter. So we have more less nighttime, more daytime of doingness. And this is one of the features of the cleric archetype, the summer archetype. Doingness, activity. More on that in a bit. Coming into the fall, which is literally a fall, like there's an ascension of the summer, and then there's like this fall, this constriction, downward constriction. If we think of spring as this outward movement, this up and out, you have summers like ascending, and then you have the fall, which is like contracting back. Right? So now we're contracting back into the fall. This is the melancholic. This is the earth element season. And there's a contraction. There's a coldness now. There's a dryness of the spent heat, the spent moisture. Why is moisture important for life? وَجَعَلْنَا مِنَ الْمَاءِ كُلَّ شَيْءٍ حَيٍّ. We have created from water every living thing, Allah says in the Quran. Water is the source of life. And so coming out of the winter, which is the water season, you bring some fire to it, you bring some heat to it, and it brings life out. It brings it from its dormancy into its activity, to its manifest state. And then it reaches maturation, and then it completes its process. And then it comes back down to the fall. It contracts into the earth, cold and dry. The melancholic, of course, as you may know from the name, is a more somber constitution. Colder, drier, more anxious, more critical, more philosophically oriented, more oriented towards death even, thinking about death, worrying about death. They're not like, and I didn't mention this, the sanguine people, the spring people who are more playful, more open-hearted, more fun-loving, right? That's their nature. They're the people that tell good stories, that are really dramatic and really fun, always smiling, cracking jokes, right? That's the sanguine. Most children begin in that sanguine state, right? And then they go through their different stages. But the melancholic, there's a contraction. There's a type of maturation now. You can even see the 4 seasons, the 4 elements happening at the life cycle. So, you're like we talked about, sanguines are born, children are born in sanguine, mid-age, 30s, 40s, they're in their choleric, they're building, they're taking care of their families, they're building their wealth, they're doing in the world, whatever. And then at some point there's this like midlife shift, right? Usually synced with menopause and that midlife crisis that we got on this side of the barrier, right? You get that midlife kind of dip, which is an invitation, of course. But people don't generally flow into that properly. And they're not educated, and that's okay, but that midlife dip usually indicates that shift into the earth, coming back down to earth. You've been doing, outwardly oriented, and now there's a transition happening. And what will you do? And then finally, you have the phlegmatic, which is the water in the winter season, right? And this is kind of the end and the beginning at the same time. You find people, for example, at the stage of their lives, almost returning back to youth in some way. Elderly people, after kind of living life, going through the ringer, having careers, loving and losing, just having children, them now becoming parents. They're like at this stage, and you find that oftentimes our parents, the grandparents, will become like little children, almost like they not regress, they actually grow into it, right? But there's something playful about them. There's something about their hearts that are open now, that they were so doing and so fixated on their projects and their agendas and their to-do lists and the efforting involved in life, which is a part of life. But now at that season, things change. They become more pensive, more patient, more witnessing. They can just sit in a room with children playing and they're just smiling and drinking their tea and just taking it in. Have you seen this before? Just old people just kind of, for hours. It's beautiful, right? And that's that stage. That there's a healthy stage of development where they disengage from life and they just become witnessing, observing. It's a very kingly, it's a very saintly state as well. Not to say that you can't have saints of different constitutions, but that's kind of, there's a true maturation in that life cycle, if you will. And we all go through these cycles in different capacities. So even if you're a choleric nature, you'll have a sanguine early childhood, more or less. You'll have a melancholic kind of midlife. You'll have a phlegmatic tone to the end of your life, though you still may have a primary constitution that you're operating from, right? So it's a qualitative kind of range that each of us can access. Okay, so that's the gist. I wanted to go through it quickly just to kind of cover it. So let's get into each of them more specifically. Any questions, actually, quickly about, yeah? Can you wait for the mic, please? Is there a mic? Maybe not. Okay, can you project?
You mentioned the Prophet ﷺ.
Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam.
We don't have a good sense of his clinical philosophy and stuff of that nature. Is that because it wasn't recorded, or why don't we have that sense?
I don't think it was recorded. I mean, he didn't teach it. And if he did, it wasn't preserved in the way that would be rigorously acceptable for us today, right? Allahu A'lam, because there were hakims at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, like Al-Harith ibn Kalda, and the Prophet ﷺ would meet with them regularly. He would meet with them. He liked to speak with the hakims. And of course, he's the hakim of all hakims, and they were studying with him. It's not like he was teaching them, and he was establishing them. And they were Muslims, many of them. But I don't think there's any real book even that's been lost. Allahu A'lam, it's just knowledge that wasn't transmitted fully. Allahu A'lam. Any other questions about temperaments or anything else? Yes? Good question. The question was, do we know the temperament of the Prophet ﷺ? The Prophet ﷺ did not have one of these 4 temperaments. He had all of them. He was even-tempered, even-temperamented, meaning he had all the virtues and good of all the 4, which I'm about to cover, and none of the vices of the 4, because he was insan al-kamil. He was a perfect man, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So he was even-tempered, and even so much so that, there's another level I didn't mention, not to complicate things, but there's 4 humors in the body that correlate with the 4 elements. These are 4 kind of there's different ways of defining the humors. 4 liquid tissue states. 4 states of our physiology that correlate with the 4 elements, right? So blood is the liquid tissue state of the spring. And so the Prophet ﷺ is narrated, when the spring would come, he would actually make a little cut between his fingers and drain the excess blood, because he was so balanced that he would into it and feel the change of his constitution through the spring season, and so he would drain blood to even out his temper. Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, right? Which is a proof of his balance. Good question. Any other questions? I think I saw one more. I'll take a quick one. Yeah. Sorry. Prophetic medicine. Tibb al-Nabawi. Yeah, I mean, look, it's a tradition that we have, and there's a hadith that we have that are narrated, and they're useful for sure, but we don't know, and we can't necessarily use them clinically because we don't know how the Prophet ﷺ was using them. So, for example, a common example is hadith on black seed, that it's a cure for everything but death. Okay? That was given to that was a prescription to somebody, right? That wasn't like a universal remedy for death, right? Because we all have to die. So what the Hakim said is that this is individualized for that person. But if you hear that hadith, and out of the love of the Prophet ﷺ, you practice it, then you'll get ajr and nur and shifa, inshallah ta'ala, not through the black seed, but through your love of the Prophet ﷺ, because they may not be indicated for you clinically. Right? There's a clinical indication for black seed. Yeah? It was actually indicated during COVID, and it had a lot of benefit. It gave a lot of benefit to people during COVID, as a prophylactic and for treatment. But it wasn't necessarily, it's not a remedy for everything but death. Right? Everyone is going to have different ailments, and they may not improve with black seed. We maybe tried that. We maybe don't feel better after taking black seed. That's okay. It's not a disproving of the hadith or whatever. It's impossible. But rather, we want to contextualize it. That was for a specific person, but in your love of the Prophet ﷺ, you take black seed, don't be surprised if you become cured. I mean, there's people that go to burdas with sick children. I know this, and I've heard this directly from them. Children that were chronically ill, and they sat in a burda, 1 hour burda session, and they swear to Allah that they did not leave that majlis except the child was fully cured. And I totally believe them. They have no reason to lie. And I'm sure there's many stories that you all know too of that. So that's a deep healing that we're not talking about. Right? That's another level of healing. I'm more, clinical in my healing. That's from Allah. Right? And really, ultimately, all shifa is from Allah. Allah is a shafi. There's a narration of someone coming to the Prophet ﷺ and offering to heal him. The Prophet ﷺ looked at him and said, you're a compassionate and kind soul, but Allah is the healer. You're not actually healing. You're not causing shifa. Allah is the shafi. Yes?
Is there any pattern to, when you're born, when you're here, or what year you're born that determines one element or anything else?
Could, yeah. But I'm not sure that knowledge is established enough to rely upon. But and this is probably controversial, but there's even there's actually a quote I want to read first. Let me find it real quick. The question was, is there a correlation between having a certain predominance of an element according to the year that you're born, the time that you're born? So there's actually, I had it open, I wanted to share it. Yeah, here we go. So here, Imam Al-Ghazali in The Alchemy of Happiness. Okay, I will share this, because I wanted to share this actually yesterday, and I forgot. So he's talking about primary, secondary causes. And he goes, for instance, if a man ceases to take any interest in worldly matters, conceives a distaste for common pleasures, and appears sunk in depression, the doctor will say, this is a case of melancholy and requires such and such prescription. The physicist will say, this is a dryness of the brain caused by hot weather and cannot be relieved till the air becomes moist. The astrologer will attribute it to some particular conjunction or opposition of planets. Thus far their wisdom reaches, says the Quran. It does not occur to them that what has really happened is this, that the Almighty has a concern for the welfare of that man, and has therefore commanded his servants, the planets and the elements, to produce such a condition in him that he may turn away from the world to his Maker. The knowledge of this fact is a lustrous pearl from the ocean of inspirational knowledge, to to which all other forms of knowledge are as islands in the sea. Which is the knowledge of ma'rifah here. He's talking about ma'rifah, the seeing Allah and everything. So it's possible that you are who you are because of a certain condition of time. The planets were set up in a certain way, or the elements, or your family dynamics, and the generational patterns, and your DNA, and all of that. But really, like the real reason is that Allah just made you like that. And He has wisdom, and out of love, and as a gift of existence, He gave you you. But underneath that rubric, yeah, there's probably some hikmah that someone can figure out, but not get lost in, of why these certain situations, why people do birth charts, prenatal birth charts, and you can check on certain things. And wallahu alam, there's probably a reality to it, but I don't think we should go into it because it's just so open to conjecture. It's not wahi, and there isn't a rigorous scientific method around it. But these things are meaningful, Allah swears by the constellations. It's a mighty oath, He says in Surah Al-Waqi'ah. Yes?
That was the ayah in the Quran?
Which?
The quote that you just repeated? Oh, subhanAllah.
I'm hearing وَإِنَّهُ لَقَسَمٌ لَوْ تَعْلَمُونَ عَظِيمٌ. Anyways, this quote was from Imam Ghazali's فَلَا أُقْسِمُ بِمَوَاقِعِ النُّجُومِ فَلَا أُقْسِمُ بِمَوَاقِعِ النُّجُومِ. I swear by the placement of the stars. وَإِنَّهُ لَقَسَمٌ لَوْ تَعْلَمُونَ عَظِيمٌ. And it is an oath that if you know is azim, it's majestic, it's mighty. Allah swears by the placement of the stars. Right? So there's a haqiqah there. But do we have that knowledge? Allahu a'lam. Is that helpful? Alhamdulillah. Okay, I'm going to keep going here because I still have things to cover. Well, we'll have more time for discussion, inshallah, next. So, going back to the sanguine personality, right, the sanguine. This is the springtime, hot and wet, air temperament. This is usually the first temperament of youth. They tend to have good circulation, have a reddish complexion, a bloodiness kind of in their cheeks, they're prone to flushing, cheerful, merry disposition. They tend to be very much oriented towards play. They tend to be more process-oriented, like to adventure, and just going out and just finding something to do. They're not planners. These are not the planning people. These are just let's go on an adventure. Let's go hit the road and just see what we come up with. See what, a farm a strawberry patch, bob for apples here, whatever. We'll just find something as we drive. That's the kind of person that they are. Very kind of open. They like to play games and travel and be distracted. They tend to also be avoidant of pain. They tend to also be in some way, kind of on the flip side of all of that, the shadow side of this, kind of more anxious. They won't show it. But if you talk to them, the sanguine internally is very anxious, right? And it's kind of part of their strategy, their adaptive strategy, to ignore the pain or to avoid the pain, be more extra playful, extra fun-loving, just to be extra. They're kind of extra people, right? And that's why we love them. The sanguines are good friends. Right? They're fun to have around. They also, on a positive sense, tend to be more optimistic, have a positive outlook, extroverted. They're people, social, amiable, so forth. They tend towards jobs that are marketing, travel. They're like the food bloggers, the fashion bloggers on Instagram. All these people. They're very, hey, this is what I'm doing. It's like those kind of people. That's just really sanguine people, right? They're into cooking and even sports. They like sports and play. They like that kind of stuff. Okay. The choleric, which is the summer archetype, the summer temperament, fire temperament, is intense. There's an intensity to them. There's a goal-orientedness to them. They are doers. These are the doers. The cholerics are the doers. They get stuff done. They can be very competitive. They don't like people getting in their way when they're doing, because the job has to get done and you're an obstacle. And so I need you to move, or I'm going to stomp over you. And this is very corporate, kind of, the corporate culture is very choleric, right? They tend to have like sharp, angular features of their face, of their jaw, penetrating eyes. They're intense, right? They're intense people. They're bold and daring, oftentimes very courageous. They have an acute intelligence. Again, their intelligence is very sharp, it's very fast, but they tend to not hold on to knowledge quick. So back to that early example, the choleric student that picks up really quick, they tend to move on quick, so they forget quick, right? And part of the cholerics being balanced is learning to have more of their opposite, which is water, which is stillness, which is, water kind of cools the fire, right? And allows them to find stillness and find knowledge and find value in just being. Because the choleric in some way has this idea about doing that they need to do and they must do and they can't not do. And maybe even finding like religious justifications for it, like, Amal salih, what's wrong with Amal salih? The best of you are the best indeed. Let me just go do as many deeds as I can. But the problem with that is that it becomes really rigid, because all you're doing is doing, and you're not allowing yourself to feel, you're not allowing yourself presence in that thing. It's just another task to check off. These are taskers. These are checklist people. These are doing, and they'll do a lot. If these people take a path, and if they take a sheikh, take a wird, these people will spend 3 years doing massive amounts of dhikr, which is great, and they'll benefit from that. They will burn out. And I know countless people that have done that, right? They burn out, and inevitably they burn out. Like, it's not even like it's an exception of the rule if they don't burn out. It's just from Allah, a gift, inaya. It's karama, it's not. They will burn out if they do that. They have to learn, take their time. They have to learn to not give themselves up to God in one great act of sacrifice. Right? They have to learn to be more process-oriented. Take the journey to Allah Ta'ala. Right? Take the scenic route. Not be so goal-oriented that they miss other people. They miss, the beautiful things in life. Their children, their wives, their spouses, whatever, the flowers, just taking a moment to feel. Like the choleric actually benefits a lot from having a sanguine friend or partner. Because they're like, let's go play. And like, no, let's go work. Like, no, you need to play. Let's go play. And then the choleric's like, fine, let's go play. And then, oh, it feels so good to play. Like, yeah, I told you. And then we come back from vacation, and the cleric's like, now you get to work. It's like, but I want to play more. The sanguine. The sanguine doesn't like to play. It does not like to work. But they can balance each other out by doing that, right? If a choleric meets with a choleric, we see them as a power couple. But then it can be a really big problem, because they'll just push each other over the edge. Not to say it doesn't work, but you have to be conscious. These people have to be conscious of who they are and the pitfalls of their relationship. It can be synergistic and like amplifying themselves, or it can be balancing or destructive. It's possible too. Okay? So a choleric, they tend to be leaders, right? They tend to be kind of top of the food chain kind of people. They can be abusive because, again, it's about the job. You're not doing your job, you can get out, right? Very kind of one-minded in that way. That's an extreme. Not all of them are like that. But that's an extreme. They have a propensity for that. Yeah? They like jobs like management, technology, statistics, engineering, programming, business, corporate. Like, that's their world. Like, you find a lot of them there, and they compete with one another in the corporate ladder and the corporate blah, 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 and they fight, and they have, they hijack each other's progresses. And, like in medical school, you hear about people that like hide the books in the library from other students. so that they can't get the books to study, so they fail. It's like that kind of competition, you know, very choleric competition. That's true, by the way, people do that. Okay. So then you have melancholic, right? You have this contraction of energy. You have this inwardness now that happens. So the melancholic is anxious and afraid, oftentimes very fear-based, but they tend to be planners. They tend to be perfectionists. They tend to be the thinkers. They overthink. They're very thinking people. They're mind people, right? They can also be very critical. That can be very useful in many ways as well. So they can kind of see through things, right? So that's one of their gifts, is actually seeing through the frou-frous and seeing through the decorum of not the decorum, the decorations of things, the illusory elements of things to the heart of the matter. So these people are really powerful people and very beautiful people and important people in our culture, especially today. Especially today. They tend to be very practical, efficient, they're dependable people, they're solid people, they're earth, right? What's earth to you? Even just intuitively, what's earth? Just solid people. Yeah? Just solid. Fire is like what? Just hot, burning, moving fast, burning up, ascending up, right? Earth, though, grounded. But because they're grounded, they kind of get stuck. And they get stuck up here. Lots of anxiety and fear, very analytical. They're perfectionists, very much prone to perfectionism and that type of rigidity. So for them, it's important to get some more perspective from the other temperaments, like to be able to see that this is not the only way of being in the world, right? Because the perfectionist idealizes perfection and only sees one way of being, which is perfect, which is usually how they are being. So that's how they can lose sight of compassion for other people, because there's only one right way, right? Islam is right and wrong. Islam teaches right and wrong, and I'm doing right and you're doing wrong, and so I am good and you are bad. And that's where that criticalness can become maladaptive and very hurtful, right? Because they have a tendency towards that. They tend to be rigid. They tend to be lean and rigid people, like leaner, thinner kind of body types, and tense. They're just tense people. They carry tension in their chest, their shoulders. They're tense people. You can feel their tension. Yeah? You find them in management, accounting, administrative work. They help build. One of the great things about the melancholics, though, is that they build institutions. They build systems. They can help. If you get a good melancholic manager on, he will rectify the whole organization, or she. They can do that. They'll find the problems. They're problem solvers. They're solution-oriented. They still have that kind of doingness of the cholerics, so they can get stuff done, and they can see to the project reasonably well. They might have an internal kind of dilemma with overthinking and worrying at night about if they're doing a right job and if they're going to get fired and if that person finished the job or not, and if they rely upon and that person kind of is weak and maybe I should cut them, and they'll overthink it, but in the all in all, they will help rectify systems because they can be amazing problem solvers. And then the phlegmatic, just a couple minutes here. The phlegmatic is the water principle, the winter principle. They tend to be plumper people in general. They have a slower metabolism. They tend to hide their emotions. They tend to be more mild and easygoing. They're not emotional in the way that like the other, like the anger of the choleric or the anxiety and the fear of the melancholic. They won't show as much, and they tend to be just kind of slower. Slower people, they're calmer, more sentimental. They tend to be religious, but not extreme. They're very mild people. If you were to, the phlegmatic is just a mild person. If you were to use one word, they're just mild people, yeah? very thoughtful, but like they have struggles with doing. That's their struggle. That they're so watery and so wintry and cold and wet and kind of almost dormant in energy that they just kind of just sit there and they want to do and they love to do, but they cannot do. They can't mount up the agency to do, and so they struggle in a very real way with getting stuff done, right? And this is the opposite. Winter is the opposite of summer, right? So the summer cannot take a chill pill, and the winter people live in the freezer, right? It's like they need to like move. And so, and when they come for counseling, it's like they tend to be very like diplomatic people, very mediating people. They're good at seeing different perspectives, not getting emotionally involved, and just kind of helping people harmonize. They have a harmonizing energy to them. But they inevitably they'll come and they'll say, I can't get my career off the ground. I can't do what I know I need to lose weight. I know I need to fix my relationships. I need to, like, I have this project, I have this brilliant idea. I just can't get organized enough to get it off the ground and like execute. It's always the same kind of thing. And for them, if they can begin to take a bit more fire in, they get really solid. They're very beautiful people. They're very mild people. They're very gentle people naturally. They don't even try. They're just very warm. I won't say warm. They're very gentle people. They can be warm, but they're not as warm as like the sanguine, very warm people. But they're warm in the sense that they won't harm you, right? They're very gentle people by their nature. And you find them in the helping careers. You find them in like nursing and social work and healthcare and psychology, teaching, child development, stuff like that. You see them in these fields. Right? So yeah, I'm becoming aware of time. We're at time exactly, which is pretty impressed. But we haven't covered, we just did an introduction to these things. I'd love to be able to talk more about this. Maybe inshallah ta'ala we can continue during our Q&A sessions, or in another session we can put together somewhere. But any quick questions before we wrap up for today? Yes.
Yeah, I was just wondering the last personality. How do you spell the word phlegmatic? I can't.
Phlegmatic?
Yeah.
PH, L-E-G, M-A-T-I-C.
And then choleric, it's like
C-H-O-L-E-R-I-C. C-H-O-L-E-R-I-C.
Now, an individual may have more than one.
Good, yeah. Individual, so we all have, so let me frame it properly. We all have all four. We all have all four. We all have earth principle, fire principle, water principle, air principle in us. It's just a matter of the ratios, the percentages, the proportions, the relationships between them. Normally we have one with a secondary that are really like obvious. You can usually capture number one, number two really well. And they tend to be, you can see how they balance each other, or they're trying to balance each other inside of you. Yes, in the back? That's a great question. Can you ask that later? Because I definitely want to, we're going to talk about that later this week. I set this up just to be a common language for us to begin to like talk about the later personality and emotional relational patterns and how these things are adaptive and maladaptive. It's a good question. Did you guys hear the question? She's asking how do maladaptive patterns like connect with these four temperaments? Maladaptive patterns are patterns that we take on as compensations for different types of experiences. So, for example, a child experiences physical abuse early in life, right? There's going to be a compensatory adaptive strategy in that child's nafs to adapt to that situation. So it could be getting angry, also, like meeting fire with fire kind of thing. Or it could be being very averse to conflict, very quiet, timid, right? So just in that example, you can see how one goes choleric, one can go phlegmatic. Very conflict averse. The phlegmatic's very conflict averse. It's, you see them, you see anger has gone to sleep here. There's no anger, there's no defense mechanism anymore. Their defense mechanism was collapsing their defense mechanism and just becoming like a fly on the wall. Phlegmatic, very mild, just I'm not here. Don't see me. I'm not going to harm you. You're not going to harm me. Just, I'm here. Yeah, that's a kind of a phlegmatic strategy. Now, that's adaptive when you're a child and you're with a big tyrant, a pharaoh in the house, right, in this example. But it's not adaptive when you're a grown adult 30 years later and you feel like every adult around you is going to hurt you and you can't show up and you can't speak and you can't do anything because you're afraid to engage in the world. That's maladaptive, right? So we all have adaptive strategies that probably in some way have turned maladaptive. That's my belief, at least. And we can talk more about that, because that's actually the core of what I get to in much of my work. I do a lot of emotional work, and that's the level that I operate and really work on with my people. Yes? Yeah. Oh, yeah. That's a good question. So the question was, how do we reconcile this idea that we have the life cycles through seasons, like we start off sanguine, choleric, melancholic, phlegmatic, and then the idea of wanting to be, or seeking balance, seeking the prophetic balance, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and not having just one temperament. It's a good question. The life cycle, the seasons of the life cycle are subtle, right? So it's not like you're going to become phlegmatic at the end of your life, necessarily, right? It may be a qualitative shift from just so if you're choleric, your phlegmaticness, if you will be different than the phlegmaticness. Like it could be just a balancing, right? Or it can be an amplification. Like the phlegmatic maybe should be a little bit more active later in life to balance that out, for example, right? So just being aware of the influences of the weather, the climate where they live geographically, but also the age that their actual physical age, right? So you find people that are like elderly that are just like still kind of hanging out, chilling, and then you have people that are like running marathons in their 80s, And that could be a choleric person or it could be a phlegmatic person that's kind of found their mojo and is trying to stay balanced at the end of their life. Allahu alam. But we're out of time for today, inshallah. So we will pick up tomorrow from here. Subhanakallah wa bihamdika ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk.